There have been so many studies lately showing that most people now feel like they need far more than $1 million to retire. We all know that inflation's been brutal the past couple of years, and that's made a lot of people question if their magic number is still enough. So here's the big question. Is $1 million still enough to retire on? Well, today we're going to answer that by walking through a real-life case study of a couple who's right on the cusp of retirement and right at that $1 million mark. Now, if you're new here, I'm Jonathan Rankin, the founder of Theorem Wealth, and for going on 20 years now, I've helped people plan not just to get to retirement, but to get through retirement. And one question I hear from almost every client is, how much do I need to retire? And for decades, hitting 7 figures, that $1 million mark, was that gold standard. But with rising costs, market volatility, and longer lifespans, is that number outdated or is it still enough? Well, let's find out. Let me introduce you to Steve and Mary. Steve's 61 and still working. Mary, she's also 61, but she stopped working years ago to raise their 4 kids. Now, I've known them for over a decade. And of course, Steve and Mary, that's not their real name, but their situation is very real. And for as long as I've known him, Steve's big goal was to get his 401k to $1 million. That was the number that made him feel safe enough to retire, and this year he finally hit it. Now with retirement just a few months away, they're asking, is $1 million enough to cover the next 25 to 30 years of our life? Now the first thing we looked at was their annual spending. They were spending about $115,000 per year after taxes, but their house is going to be paid off later this year, so it's going to drop to $90,000 per year after taxes in retirement. Now, they might not have a mortgage, but they do want to travel more in the early years of retirement and help with future grandkids. Now, right away, this is more than the old 4% rule on $1 million portfolio would suggest. See, 4% on $1 million is just $40,000 a year, so clearly, Social Security and investments are going to have to work together to cover that gap. Now, here's where their situation is a little different. See, Mary has no Social Security benefit of her own, so she'll only receive a spousal benefit on Steve's record. Now, here's how that works. See, at full retirement age, a spousal benefit can be up to 50% of the higher earning spouse's full retirement age benefit. And Steve's full retirement age benefit is $37,248 a year, which is about $3,104 a month. This means that Mary's maximum spousal benefit at her full retirement age of 67 would be around $18,624 a year or $1,552 a month. But here's the catch. If Mary claims early, well, that spousal benefit will be permanently reduced. And since she's about to be 62, claiming in just a few months could drop it to around 35 to 37% of Steve's full retirement age benefit instead of 50%. So we're going to run through all 3 scenarios of both claiming at 62, which is more years of income but smaller checks for life, both waiting until full retirement age, so fewer years of income but larger monthly benefits, and we'll run through what if Mary claims early at 62 and Steve delays until 70, giving them some income sooner while maximizing Steve's benefit for life and increasing her spousal benefit later if something happened to Steve. Now, since Steve and Mary will both retire before 65, they'll face 3 years of private health insurance premiums before Medicare kicks in. And in their case, that's about $1,200 a month, roughly $43,000 a year, just to bridge that gap. We're going to cover all these things, so let's dive into their plan and see how it looks. Now, before we move on, the truth is that retirement planning isn't just about hitting some number like $1 million. It's about how all the pieces fit together. When you claim Social Security, which accounts you draw from first, how you invest, and how you protect against taxes and market downturns. You get any of those wrong, and you could be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table over the course of your lifetime. So to make sure all of those details are locked in, click the link in the description below and book a call with me directly, and I'll show you exactly how to structure your plan so that all those pieces work together for a confident retirement. All right, so I have one last question for you. What would you do now that you know a little bit more about Steve and Mary's situation? Would you retire now or would you work a couple more years? Drop your response in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think you would do if you were in their situation, knowing what you know about them now. But let's dive into their plan so we can go through all the specifics and some of the other planning scenarios that we're going to look at. They have a probability of success at 70%. What this tells us is that they're on the border, on the cusp of being able to retire successfully without having to worry about money, because we typically target an 80%. And what this means is runs it through what's called Monte Carlo simulation, which is 1,000 different simulations of market cycles, and it will give you a probability of success of how many of those cycles did you make it through. Now what this means, this doesn't mean that 30% of the time you're going to be destitute and run out of money. What this tells us is that 30% of times you're going to have to make some sort of modification in retirement. You're going to have to reduce spending at some point, maybe just a little bit, to have a longer expectancy for those assets so that longevity is not an issue. Because in this case, we run this out till they're 90 years old. So at 90 years old, there's a 70% likelihood that they're going to have around $625,000 of assets left over. But this is just looking at what does it look like if they both take Social Security at 67 and they need that $95,000 of after-tax income to live off of. So there are some things that we want to be able to look at to assess whether or not there's other things that we need to consider. So the first is, if we wanted to get to that 80% probability of success, the maximum amount that they can retire safely on would be $92,000 of after-tax income. So as we can see, there's already a little bit of modification if they want to just increase their probability of success. Now, there are some scenarios that we want to look at. One of the questions that we always get is around sequence of returns. And we did a full video breaking down exactly what sequence of returns are that we're going to link right here. But sequence of returns means that if you see a negative portfolio shock in the first few years of retirement, how that can negatively impact your long-term retirement success. So in this scenario, we're going to look at what happens if the market drops by 20% next year when Steve retires. So as we can see, their probability of success drops from 70% down to 18%. In fact, they end up running out of money because the assets only last till age 80. So this is something, as they're starting to build out and plan their investment mix, it's important to make sure they factor sequence of returns in. As we talked about, going through and analyzing what type of Social Security benefit they should claim. So we first looked at both taking it at 67, which is their full retirement age, but what if they took it at 62? Is that something that would be more beneficial? So if they both took Social Security at 62, it would actually drop their probability of success, reducing their portfolio assets over time. Now, the reason that happens is because they're getting smaller checks, but they are getting them for longer. But the reality is, if we're running this out till age 90, it's past that break-even point of when it makes sense to take it early versus delay it. In this scenario, if we were to adjust their life expectancy to 78 years old, well, then taking it at 62 would probably be the right answer. But because we have it running till 90, this is why you can see the point where it breaks down and goes into the gray. That's where it's a negative benefit to take it at 62 versus at full retirement age. So it's important to understand that nobody knows what the exact right day for Social Security is until we know the day you're going to pass away. And nobody has that crystal ball. So you have to base it on best guesses with your family's health and also what do the numbers say for your long-term retirement. Now, the other strategy that we're going to look at is what happens if Mary takes it at 62, but we delay Steve's until age 70, because by delaying Steve's until 70, this is going to lock in a larger widow benefit. If Steve were to pass away before Mary, she would step up into his higher benefit. But in this scenario, as we can see, there really isn't a benefit because the long-term portfolio is actually going to be drawn down a lot faster and it reduces their value over time. Now, from a probability of success standpoint, we go from a 70% probability of success down to 68. So it's not as much of an impact as both of them claiming at 62, but it's still a reduction in their overall benefits. Now, what I will say is if we build out the plan where Steve does predecease Mary, then this will likely be a better scenario for them. But that's something that we would have to dig into. And if you want us to help dig into your Social Security strategy, then click that link in the description below. We'd be happy to walk you through it because it is a very big decision for retirement. Now, one of the questions that I get all the time is, where should I be investing? Should I be investing in pre-tax or Roth, and does it make a difference? We want to take a step back and let's look at what if Steve had, over the course of years, started investing into a Roth and he still hit that $1 million mark. Let's assume that 30% of that $1 million is in Roth and 70% is in pre-tax 401k. So $300,000 in Roth, $700,000 in pre-tax 401k. What is the difference there? Well, in this case, by looking at that scenario, the probability of success would go from 70% up to 79%. So you're getting a much bigger benefit over time because of having that Roth asset that's not going to be this taxable event. So if you are younger than in your 60s and you've got a decade or more to getting to retirement, starting that Roth bucket might be beneficial because it's going to give you more tax diversification in retirement. And having options in retirement is extremely important. I've seen so many people just like Steve get to retirement and have all of their assets in pre-tax 401ks, and there's very little tax flexibility that you're going to have if that's the scenario. So in this case, having that Roth IRA would be extremely beneficial. Now, as we know, over the years, Pension plans have become a lot less popular because companies are shifting to 401k models where the burden of responsibility is going to be on the participant. But what if Steve had a $31,000 pension? What benefit would that be? How much more better off would his retirement look just by adding $31,000 a year? Well, as you could see, he would go from a 70% probability of success up to 99% probability of success. It would be a huge benefit by adding that pension. So having that does give a bigger floor for your assets not to be drawn down over the course of time, because that plus Social Security will give him the foundation for the retirement lifestyle that they want. So it's a very big benefit. Now, one thing we do need to factor in is their healthcare costs before Medicare kicks in, because we know they're going to have to bridge until Medicare, and that $95,000 that we're planning on them to live off of after taxes, that's their lifestyle costs. That's not their healthcare costs in this scenario. So we need to add that in as an additional cost and see what that does to their retirement. So if we add that in, that's going to bring them from a 70% probability of success down to a 60%. And so it is a long-term hit, because now they're going to have to make much more modifications in retirement. In fact, when we recalculate what it takes to get to that 80%, it's no longer $92,000, now it's $89,000. So as you can see, by adding additional cost early on, it's reducing how much that long-term livability is on that portfolio. So now we start at $95,000 without healthcare costs. It drops to $92,000 just to get to that 80% probability of success. And now we drop another $3,000 to get to $89,000. So as you can see, the way that these different levers work when you're planning your retirement, it's important to understand where the give and take is. So in this scenario, we might have to take a little bit from the living expenses over time, so that way we can afford the healthcare costs and be a little bit more flexible with the portfolio, because that 4% rule and taking out more than, ignore the 4% rule. Now let's say that Steve and Mary, they had to live off of $95,000 a year. That was what maintained their lifestyle, and there's no budging on that. Well, to afford those healthcare costs before Medicare, a safe retirement age would be just waiting an additional year. 63 would be a lot better than 62, because it gives their assets another year. It also reduces how much they're going to need to bridge for Medicare, and it's going to give another year of savings. So that would actually get them to that 80% probability of success. So there's a lot of different levers that you can pull in retirement, and it's important to go through all of them. Now for Steve and Mary, $1 million plus the right Social Security strategy, tax planning, and investment mix, it gives them the retirement that they want. But there's probably going to be some sacrifices along the way they're going to have to do. But here's the thing, that's their plan, it's not yours. See, your retirement number depends on your expenses, your income sources, how you invest, and how you protect yourself from the unexpected. And the sooner you see how those pieces fit together for your life, the more confident you'll be about when you can actually retire. Now, if you want to know whether or not your numbers work, then click the link in the description below and we'll run the same type of analysis that I just walked through. That way you can stop wondering and start planning with clarity. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're wondering what it takes to retire off dividends alone, then be sure to check out this video coming up next where I break it all down. I'll see you there.